I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from across Ukraine, discuss recent developments in Germany, and we analyse the decision of London Mayor Sadiq Khan to block a plan to send cars to Ukraine that would otherwise be scrapped under London's new ultra-low emission zone.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 18th of December. 1 year and 297 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Sternley, editor of the Central Asia and South Caucasus Bulletin James Kilner, and our guest is Dr Thomas Clausen, a historian who works at a liberal think tank in Berlin. But first, the news from Ukraine. Over the weekend, the drone battles and missile strikes continued across the country. This comes from the US-based think tank, the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. Russian forces conducted a series of missile and drone strikes against Ukraine on the night of December the 16th and 17th. The Ukrainian Air Force reported that Russia launched a KH-59 missile from occupied Crimea and Kherson Oblast, and an Iskander-M missile as well. The Ukrainian Air Force, for their part, reported that Russian forces also launched 20 Shahed 136-131 drones from Krasnodar Krai, as well as Cape Chowder in occupied Crimea. Ukrainian officials said that they shot down the KH-59 missile and all of the drones over Odessa, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia and Khmelnytskyi oblasts. So, what are the Russians aiming for? Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Colonel Yuri Ilyat stated on December the 17th that Russian forces targeted Kherson city and an airfield in Khmelnytskyi Oblast. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on December 16th that Ukrainian forces have destroyed 104 out of 112 Russian Shahed drones launched at Ukraine in the past week. On the Russian side, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that Russian air defenses shot down 35 Ukrainian drones over Lipetsk, Rostov and Volgograd oblasts on the night of December the 16th. Rostov Governor Vasily Golubev claimed on December the 17th that Russian forces shot down most of the drones, and Russian and Ukrainian sources have stated that a Ukrainian drone damaged at least one Russian aircraft at an airfield in Rostov Oblast. Elsewhere, artillery duels have continued up and down the front. Near Bakhmut, Russia has said that it destroyed Ukrainian camouflaged self-propelled guns and a tank. The footage that comes from the Russian Ministry of Defense, so obligatory pinch of salt here, purportedly shows Russian forces destroying 2 Ukrainian self-propelled guns and a tank with Lancet kamikaze drones near Andrivka. We have not been able to independently verify these claims or the footage, but if it's true, it's more evidence of the capability and effectiveness of the Lancet drones that we've known for months have been one of the chief tormentors of Ukrainian troops. Some more news that we also need to take with appropriate caveats that's coming out this morning. Anti-Putin paramilitaries say that they've staged a cross-border attack inside Russia's Belgorod region. The Freedom of Russia Legion, a Ukrainian-based paramilitary group of Russians who are, remember, designated as terrorists by Moscow, claiming responsibility. They said that they destroyed a platoon stronghold of Russian troops near Terebreno village and later rigged the site with mines. They did not specify whether it had destroyed infrastructure or killed soldiers. Just to remind ourselves, the Freedom of Russia Legion formed in spring 2022 to fight Putin's forces from within the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine. Earlier on Sunday, the governor of Belgorod region said that Terebreno, the village, was under fire from Ukraine's armed forces and that a shooting battle was underway on the village edge. Moving on, a senior army general, Ukrainian, has told Reuters that frontline Ukrainian troops face shortages of artillery shells and have scaled back some military operations because of a shortfall of foreign assistance, something that James Kilner will talk about later, I'm sure. So this comes from Brigadier General Oleksandr Tarnavsky, who's speaking after Republican lawmakers held up a $60 billion US aid package and Hungary blocked 50 billion euros in an EU funding bid for Kyiv. We discussed all of that at length on Friday. The Brigadier General said there's a problem with ammunition, especially post-Soviet shells. That's 122mm and 152mm, and today these problems exist across the entire front line. He also said that the shortage of artillery shells was a very big problem, and the drop in foreign military aid was having an impact on the battlefield. Just to finish off before we go to Francis, Ukraine's army chief Valery Zaluzhny said on Monday that the situation on the front line had not reached a stalemate. Answering a question about whether he considers the battlefield situation a stalemate, he replied, "No." This comes from Ukraine's RBC media, and he declined to comment on whether Ukraine would continue counteroffensive operations during the winter due to the sensitivity of the matter. And just to finish this section, Valery Zaluzhny also said on Monday that a covert listening device had been found in one of the offices where he works, and hinted, without elaborating, that the bugs were detected in other locations too. He said to local media about Sunday's revelation from Ukraine's security service that during a routine sweep, a bug was found in a room he used. The device wasn't working. "I have several offices where I work. This happened in one of them," Mr. Zaluzhny said. "We checked the room and found the device." Those are, I think, the most important battlefield updates. So let's go to Francis Durnley first to talk us through some of the other stories over the weekend. Francis.
Well, thank you, David. Further to Thomas, it's great to be sharing the airwaves with James Kilner again. We were sharing a pint a couple of weeks ago and realised that we hadn't been on the podcast together since September, I believe, when I was watching world leaders munch Mars bars at the UN. He is going to be covering one or two of the big political stories in detail as they warrant deeper analysis. But before he does so, here are a few other updates in other realms, as you say. Whilst not the biggest international story, I'm going to start with a row that's erupted here in Britain. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan has blocked a plan to send cars to Ukraine that would otherwise be scrapped under a green scheme designed to reduce pollution in the capital. So in a letter written to Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, of course, obtained by the Telegraph, the mayor has said he will not allow the vehicles, which tend to be 4x4s and pickup trucks, to be sent to the war zone as originally planned, because they did not meet the legal threshold, his term, that requires the scrappage scheme to benefit Londoners from, quote, an economic, social and environmental perspective. Now, many are, understandably, pretty incredulous at this. So just to give you the full context, under the London ULEZ scheme, motorists are able to claim a one-off payment if they scrap a vehicle that does not comply with the mayor's new pollution levy. If they instead keep their non-compliant vehicles, they must pay a daily charge. Now, back in September, Klitschko wrote to Mr. Khan after noting this scheme, proposing that some of the vehicles be donated to Ukraine. He said they'd have enormous potential and could be used in a variety of life-saving and transport roles. But it's this proposal that Sadiq Khan has turned down. Now, just to give you a flavour of some of the reaction to this, Susan Hall, a Conservative candidate for the Mayor of London, has criticised the decision in the strongest possible terms. She's told us Khan's refusal to send scrapped cars to Ukraine, citing a legal quirk, is absurd. Londoners who choose to scrap their cars should have the freedom to decide for themselves if they want their car sent to support Ukraine. Standing with Kyiv against tyrants like Putin is not only a moral imperative, but also in the best interest of all Londoners and the global community. Now, I'm very aware this story may come across as rather parochial, but I mention it here because of what it tells us about the evolving political context here in Britain and also in the wider West. I would wager that this denial would not have been politically possible, say, a year ago. It's revealing that the mayor now thinks it is. He may still have to back down, and I wouldn't be surprised if he does. But that he able to do this, I think, tells its own story and is indicative of a trend that we are seeing at the moment as Ukraine has slightly dipped out of the key headlines. However, I do believe that with things quietening down in Israel, Gaza, or at least some of the initial shock dissipating, that Ukraine will return to being the core geopolitical issue of the moment. And indeed, there is already some evidence of that. And I'm sure that would be of some relief to Kyiv if it does. Now, in other news, a binder containing highly classified information on Russian election interference went missing at the end of the Trump administration and has never been recovered. That's according to US sources in a major piece of reportage by CNN and others. American intelligence officials are concerned that the file of national secrets could be exposed, revealing the CIA's official assessment of Russian attempts to secure the 2016 election for Donald Trump. And it comes as the Kremlin said on Friday that it wants a more constructive relationship with the US following the elections next year, in a hint, not a surprising one, that Putin would favour Trump over Joe Biden, given Trump's remarks about Putin and Russia and the war in Ukraine in the past. Now, the binder was last seen, we're told, in the White House in the final days of Mr. Trump's presidency, as aides worked to redact classified information from the FBI's investigation into Russian interference. It is believed to contain intelligence gathered by the US and other NATO allies and details the work of Russian agents during the 2016 election. Now, there was a separate report by Robert Mueller, who was appointed to investigate Russian interference in 2016. Now, that report, which has been made public, as it were, found that Putin's agents attempted to sway the election results in a sweeping and systematic fashion, direct quote. The report, though, found no collusion between Trump and Putin, as many had claimed and indeed had been an election issue. But it did rule that Trump was receptive to offers of assistance from the Russian state. Now, it's believed that the binder was held at the CIA, with intelligence officials requiring top-level clearance to handle it within the agency's headquarters in Langley, Virginia. But it later went missing during a frantic attempt to declassify reports relating to Russian interference by Trump and his aides as he prepared to leave office in January 2021. That's what many sources have told CNN. Now, I think we will hear more about this story as we get closer to the election next year. The role of Russia in elections, not only in the European context but in the United States, I think is destined to become a much bigger talking point this time around than it was last time around. And it was pretty sizable last time, just given the upgrade of Russian interference in numerous entities and programs as a result of course, what many would argue is a sort of existential war for the Kremlin regime in Ukraine. But that's a subject for another time. Lastly, yet another serious allegation is being made regarding Russian war crimes, namely that Russian soldiers carved swastikas into the foreheads of 2 Ukrainian prisoners of war, leaving them struggling with severe psychological trauma. Suffice to say, this act was likely inspired by Moscow's claims that this war in Ukraine is a special denazification operation. It may also have mimicked a scene in the well-known film Inglourious Bastards, which I only mention because there is a well-recorded phenomena in war of some soldiers seeking to take on the sort of strongman role of characters in cinema. Film has long served as an inspiration, of course, as much as it is a warning as regard to war, even if that's not the intention of the directors. It plays a role in popular consciousness and culture, after all. Now, mobilised into the Ukrainian military not long after Russia invaded, one of these Ukrainian soldiers was captured after a fierce skirmish last December in the Donetsk region. His captors took him to a processing sector, we understand, where he was subjected to 2 weeks of torture. They kept him in a basement with no food, only taking him out to beat him unconscious. Now, apparently the swastika, and we've got images in the story on our website, which just speaks to the barbarity of this, frankly, runs from just below his hairline to above his brow and was likely cut with a knife, the doctors believe. Soon after, he was transferred to Chechnya, where he arrived almost naked and covered in layers of dried blood and was released 5 months later in a prisoner exchange. A year on, the psychological scars are said to be extremely deep, and he finds it almost impossible to talk about what happened to him. The physical marks, of course, remain, and whilst there are treatments available, according to our story, these kind of cases are not a priority in a seriously stretched healthcare system at war, where wounded soldiers and civilians facing life-threatening injuries often take precedence, and that's something that we've spoken about, I seem to recall, with Svetlana Morelets in the past. But for more on that story, Liz Cookman has written it up for us on our website, and we'll have a link in the description because it goes into much more detail of the terrible case that's been recorded by this.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, for your updates there. Let's go to James Kilner then. James, you're in Riga. How is it? And would you like to start by talking to us about the tensions growing on the Finnish-Russian border?
Hi, David. Yeah, I'm in Riga. It was very snowy, and now we've had a thaw, and a huge amount of water flooding the streets and running down the side of the streets. Lumps of ice falling off buildings, so you have to be pretty careful at the moment. On to the issues of the day, which is the Ukraine-Russia war. It was, as usual, busy weekend. I'm going to concentrate on 2 or 3 stories that I think listeners need to give their attention to. The first, with the big headline story over the weekend, is really these warnings by US and EU diplomats that unless these 2 massive aid bills from being held up by within the EU and the US Senate, unless they are passed, Ukraine could lose the war within a few months by the end of the summer. One diplomat was saying, another diplomat was saying this would have enormously negative consequences for the security of Europe. And they're referencing Bucha and all that sort of destruction, but a slight hyperbole around that. But anyway, it would be incredibly negative for Europe, of course, and the concept of Ukraine losing is a deeply worrying one. And really, this comes down to weapon supplies and ammunition supplies, as Francis was saying, and David also referenced earlier, David. And they were saying that unless the EU and the US got their act together and passed these bills, they're being held up in the Senate because of rows over immigration in the EU. Hungary and Slovakia have blocked it, or Hungary at least, and Austria was on the fence, quibbling over some details. But unless these bills are passed, these diplomats were saying that Ukraine's going to run out of missiles, air defense missiles, shoulder missiles, and tank missiles, this sort of thing. And it comes at a time when reports from the front line that I've been reading already show that Ukraine is running out of artillery shells, of kit. Reports say that Russia can fire up to 5 times as many shells in a battle as Ukraine, for example. And I read a report last week, these patched together attack helicopters that the Ukrainians have are limited in their mission runs. They can only get deployed against vehicles, i.e. they can't get deployed against infantry going over the top around Avdiivka. So really worrying signs there. And I'd really like listeners to try and compare this to the sort of messages we're getting from Russia. Putin signed deals with North Korea, we know, with Iran, etc. He's reorientated his economy to support his military-industrial complex. He's very much on the front foot, and it very much seems that the Kremlin feel they have their supply lines, their military supply lines, in order. Whereas the Ukrainians are reliant on the West, and we know that the West is getting tired. We're back in this war, and it's the support there is fracturing, and that's very, very dangerous for Ukraine for all the obvious reasons. And this sort of leads into the second story of the weekend, the big story of the weekend. Was this report in New York Times? One of their reporters had spoken to some of the Marines who'd come back from fighting a battle on the left bank of the Dnipro River around a fishing village called Klinky, where they had a couple of months ago or 6 weeks ago established some sort of toehold or foothold on that side of the river, and Ukrainian cheerleaders were saying this is potentially a very significant breakthrough. It's been a very daring mission. Now we've got this foothold. Now we can build a proper bridgehead and really push through towards Crimea, etc. A few hundred miles away, but anyway, and so start really pushing the Russians back. The messages from the Ukrainian Marines who were talking to New York Times gave a very different picture. They said it's an absolute hellscape, having to step over their comrades' bodies. Any talk of a genuine foothold, toehold, military bridgehead is misplaced. It's really desperate stuff. And an important story there, and actually one that tallies with what Vladimir Putin was saying at his press conference, his marathon press conference on Thursday, which I watched 4 hours long. He referenced this particular battle at one point and said that Ukrainian forces there were getting slaughtered by Russian artillery. So really worrying signs, important signs to remember that not everything you hear from both sides is accurate, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. And it comes at a time when, as we discussed at length, the Russians are on the front foot, on the front line around Avdiivka, and seem to have stopped a Ukrainian advance in the south, which the Ukrainian army has pushed through to another bridgehead, but is around Robotynia, and has been stalled there again. So important to keep in mind, for listeners, keep in mind around that. And then the third story, the final story that I think is important, David, for your listeners, catching up with the weekend news, is Putin's threats towards Finland. Finland joined NATO in April, having been neutral since the end of World War II. It had been part of the Russian Empire until 1917, and then there was a period of independence, and then it was invaded, the Winter War of 1939 and 1940, etc., and then fought against the Soviet Union during World War II, intermittently before having to switch sides again. Anyway, that's the backstory. It had been neutral. It decided to join NATO after Kremlin invaded Finland in February last year, and it eventually joined in April. Now, these comments by Putin were really some of the first direct comments that I can remember him making since Finland joined NATO. We know that Putin absolutely hates NATO. It's one of his key reasons for invading Ukraine. And he said that Finland joining NATO was going to cause problems. And he said, we didn't have any problems with Finland previously. Now they joined NATO, we're going to have problems. And he confirmed he's reactivating an old military district, the Leningrad military district, which borders Finland, southern Finland and the Baltics as a consequence. So difficult, worrying things here. This is all part of the bigger story about Russia increasing its militarization, etc., and a reaction to this NATO phobia that Russia has. And it also plays into Finnish concerns that the Kremlin has triggered some sort of hybrid warfare against it in the last couple of months. If you remember, in November and the beginning of December, Finland was accusing Russia of funneling migrants from the Middle East and South Asia through to its borders, giving them bicycles to help them get across the border, etc., as some sort of hybrid warfare to unsettle Finland and the EU. So now we sort of had confirmation from Putin that he is agitating, to put it lightly, along the Finnish border.
Well, thank you very much, James, for taking us through all of that. Just quickly, you said that you were watching the marathon press conference and question and answer session from Putin. Is there anything you took away from it? Was it as difficult to get through as some of the analysts have suggested?
Yeah, I think it was actually. It was a fairly dull, I'd say, is probably the right word, dull press conference by Putin standard. There were hints at his confidence and his aggression, but really it was very focused at a domestic audience, trying to display sort of confidence and calmness. If you remember, a week earlier he'd confirmed that he was going to run in the presidential election in March. And actually, over this weekend, he officially took the nomination by a group of. He confirmed that he's running as an independent, nominated by several hundred Russians, etc. So you've got to look at that question and answer session in the context of a domestic presidential campaign, and he needs to portray it in an aura of almost dullness and normality, having triggered this war which has upset stability within Russia. He's got to try and reimpose that. So I think that's what he was trying to do. As far as listeners to this podcast are concerned, the big takeaway was he actually reconfirmed his primary initial war objective in Ukraine. He said, my objectives haven't changed from February 22. And we all know that was the capitulation of Ukraine, the surrender of Ukraine. So maybe that was important confirmation of his actual ambition and the fact he's in this war for the long run, and he's prepared to see it to the end and looking confident. I think that is the main takeaway for listeners of this podcast.
Brilliant. And just very quickly, James, Christmas is obviously approaching in Riga. What's it like to be there? Are you seeing much evidence?
Yeah, it's a lovely Christmas market. It's plenty of tourists piling into the old town. It's much more laid back and less pumped up and less commercial than Edinburgh, where I'm normally based. So it's a relief to be here. Particularly nice gingerbread to be eating and Glühwein and more wine to be drinking. But yeah, all good. I couldn't recommend it highly enough.
That's made me actually quite jealous. Thank you so much, James. Look forward to hearing from you at the end of the podcast too. But Dr. Thomas Clausen, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Francis now to conduct this part of the interview, but we look forward to hearing what you have to say, and I'm sure we'll have some questions as well at the end of this. Francis Sternley.
Well, thanks, David and Thomas. Always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. It's actually been a little while, a few months, but whenever we're on, of course, we talk about Germany and also some historical topics. So let's begin with the former. Last week on Friday, we talked on the podcast about this EU summit and Olaf Schultzs' successful attempt, some calling it a masterstroke, to, in a sense, convince Orban, or using some jiggery pokery, to stop him blocking EU accession talks for Ukraine to begin. Obviously, he wasn't happy about those proceeding, but he was told by Schultz to leave the room so that the rest of the members of the EU could grant the accession talks to begin whilst he was conveniently out having a coffee. This has never been done in the EU before, and many people are applauding Olaf Scholz for doing this. But how is the German media talking about this diplomatic feat?
Thanks, Francis. Good to be back. Well, in the last episode of the podcast, Joe made the excellent point that in some way the real actual headline is that Orban was able to point out that there are 75 further occasions to block Ukraine's accession to the EU. And I would say that the reaction to the meeting in the German media was likewise rather muted. Yes, the breakthrough was noted, including Scholz's diplomatic feat of convincing Orban to leave the room during the vote. But as Markus Becker, a journalist at the Spiegel, noted, this was possibly the most expensive coffee of all times. And likewise, the left-leaning Taz titled, "It was a coffee with a shot of bribe money." And after all, Orban got his billions. There's another fight for releasing the funds that Ukraine desperately needs in January. And there are many more opportunities for Orban to throw a spanner in the works. But on the other hand, I would say that it is a rather historic step for the European Union and for Ukraine, because it makes clear that there is a vision for the post-war period, and that this vision includes a free Ukraine, which will be part of the free world in the West. Of course, it's a constant theme in our discussions that Western politics moves too slowly and too hesitantly, but it is also notable that we are observing quite a significant development, and I can only concur with Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, who not only applauded Scholz's initiative, but who also said that he hopes that this will be a broader and irreversible reversal of Germany's position.
Well, thank you very much for that. Interesting to hear the perspective from Berlin. Now, more generally, Germany has been in the news quite a lot recently. Lots of criticism sent its way with regard to not sending Taurus missiles, although it is, of course, important to also remember that Germany is still the biggest European donator to Ukraine of military equipment and other things too. But in your view, how has the public opinion in Germany shifted with regards to the support for Ukraine in the last few months since we had you on?
That's quite a difficult question. For a start, there's a lot of discontent with Scholz's traffic light coalition in general. So a recent survey by Germany's public broadcasting company, the ARD, showed that 81% of the population are dissatisfied, so mildly or strongly dissatisfied with the government. And a lot of this content has to do with domestic problems, energy prices, climate policies, etc. But there's also some grumbling about the position regarding Ukraine. And it's quite interesting to look at the numbers and the opinion polls. And in my view, the most important number is that still only, or well, significantly, 37% of Germans says that Germany's support for Ukraine by means of weapons delivery has been going too far. But that also means, of course, that there are 73% who say, well, it's not going far enough, or at least it's sufficient. And likewise, only 20% of Germans criticize the sanctions against Russia, as opposed to 42% who think that there should be even further sanctions against Russia. Now, the big question, and I think this is also a theme that came up in recent episodes because it's also a discussion point in a lot of other Western countries, there are 55% of Germans who think there should be more diplomatic efforts to end the war. And to me, this shows in a way that there's still a widespread misreading of Putin's actual intentions, which go, as you, of course, agree, far beyond securing a land bridge to Crimea. But I would say it's pretty clear that he still aims at destroying the entirety of the Ukrainian nation. And then potentially he's planning to further expand into the states of the former Warsaw Pact, including Riga and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, etc. So the call for more diplomacy probably also reflects a certain pessimism about Ukraine's chances to win. So 50%, so roughly half of Germany's population, believe that it's not going to be possible for Ukraine to win with Western weapons. But rather ironically, and this is a different opinion poll from September, 56% also don't believe it's possible to end the war by diplomatic means. So it's quite unclear how the German public thinks the war is ultimately going to end. But finally, also with a view to the recent EU summit, the most interesting point is probably that 56% of or roughly half of the Germans support the idea that Ukraine should join the EU in the next couple of years. And even though it might take much longer than those couple of years, it shows that Scholz's initiative at least had some public backing.
Interesting. Now, Schultz, I think it's important that we, underline the point that this is actually a very challenging moment politically for Olaf Schultz and his traffic light coalition. They've had a rough few weeks, few months, one could argue, really, and it's not even clear that they can pass a budget for 2024. What are the implications of that, in your view, for Germany's financial and material support for Ukraine? Because, of course, they have been this major backer. And if that does cause difficulties, I'm guessing it could be quite severe. But interested to hear your perspective on that.
Well, indeed, we had a couple of very interesting weeks since the German Supreme Court judged that Scholz's budget for 2024 contravened the debt brake of the German constitution. So after a few long nights, there's now been a new compromise, a new budget. And we're going to see how that'll go. There's at the moment in Berlin a huge protest by farmers who are saying that they are bearing the brunt of the new savings that Scholz tried to implement. But I think the most important message with regards to Ukraine is that the support will not be cut for the moment. There are 8 billion euros in the budget for further weapons deliveries and 6 billion euros of support for Ukrainian refugees in Germany. Having said this, as far as I understood it, the money for Ukrainian weapons will be taken out of the special fund of 100 billion euros of the Bundeswehr that was part of the whole Zeitenwende package. And to be honest, that's quite a difficult decision because Germany's armed forces need the resources themselves. And it's also not clear how Germany will eventually fulfill NATO's 2% quota. And I think most military experts, as far as I understood it, think that 2% is actually far too little. And not even being able to match that is certainly going to cause problems for the armed forces, but it's also going to raise quite a few eyebrows in America, where not only the Republicans have been arguing for quite some time that there's a certain amount of free riding going on, and I can't see how Germany cannot fulfill those 2%.
Yeah, it's not quite the Zeitenwende that Olaf Schultz promised in terms of military spending, at least. I think it's just worth, since you mentioned that, 2024, I believe I'm right in saying, will mark 10 years since NATO passed that suggestion, I suppose it was. It wasn't formally mandated that we would have 2 NATO countries contributing 2%, and only a handful. Sometimes it depends on the given year, but usually it's only Britain and 1 or 2 others that fulfill that 2%. And so it speaks to that failure you articulate there. And of course, Donald Trump particularly was the one who famously in that clip was criticising the Germans and others for not doing that. And of course, that they sort of laughed in his face back then, but it doesn't seem really a laughing matter now. But as somebody was saying to me last week, I think it's also, we're in a catch-22 situation here, because of course, if, for example, NATO does suddenly begin spending 2%, every country sends 2%, then some in America will start pointing and say, well, actually, Europe doesn't need us, we can step back. But of course, if they don't start doing it, then you get the criticisms that you've just made, which is that, of course, from American perspective, they'll say, well, they're not pulling their weight, why should we be the ones that bail them out? So with the political fault lines being as they are at the moment, this is actually extremely precarious for Europe. And really, it depends, I think, on the ideological underpinning of whoever is in the White House. But let's return to the ideological underpinning in Germany. Now, in the spring, you wrote a short article about Putin's influence on extremist parties in Germany, on the left and on the right, something that's actually quite rare to have them in both camps, as it were, at the same time. Usually in European countries, it's usually on one side more than the other. How influential are they now, almost 2 years into the war? Is there a danger that they will pull the country in more of one direction or another and more sceptically on Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I would say that also in some other countries you can see a weird divergence of the extreme right and the extreme left, be it the communists and Le Pen in France, or maybe even some of the squad of the Democrats and some of the fringes of the Republicans, who are both very critical of support for Ukraine. But in Germany, I think there's been quite a long tradition of national Bolshevism. And indeed, I do think that both the extreme left and the extreme right are quite pro-Putin minded, or that they show certain, that they are quite close to saying, well, we should now seek diplomatic solutions. We need Russia. We should stop weapons deliveries, etc., etc. But I don't think that those voices, and that's a contrast to other countries, will become part of official government policies. So both the AfD and the Linke, and now a new party that was founded by Sarah Wagenknecht, which is trying to tap into this national Bolshevist milieu, if I can say it like this, but provocatively. And I don't think they will become part of any ruling coalition after a future German election. But I think it's still very worthwhile to look very closely what's going on there and what kind of statements they make. And for example, a few months ago, Tino Chrupalla, who is one of the co-chairs or co-leaders of the Alternative for Germany, so the right-wing populist party, he said, multipolarity means that the world is no longer ruled by a single world power, but by several equal powers enforcing their ideas of law and order in their regions. And I think that's a very striking statement by the leader of a party that is part of the German parliament, because first of all, it very much echoes Putin's idea of a multipolar world order, but also it's quite striking that a German politician dares to say that there are certain regions where great powers should enforce law and order, as if the countries in those regions don't have independent sovereignty. And this is a concept that is taken basically from Carl Schmitt, a German lawyer who was very close to the Nazis, who published in 1941 a huge treatise on völkerrechtliche Großraumordnung, so international order in great spaces, where he basically advanced the idea that states that are alien to a certain space or to a certain region should not intervene there. And the implication, I would say, is that Chrupalla thinks that this is not only a good concept, but that clearly Russia has the right to do whatever Russia wants in their space, and that the West, as a alien sort of power, should stay out of this region. And this is very worrisome. And maybe to add to this, it's also clear that where he gets those ideas from, because a couple of months ago, one of his staffers, Dimitrios Kisoudas, published a small treatise in one of the right-wing publishing houses entitled Middle Europe and Multipolarity, where he also argues that the age of multipolarity is dawning, so also echoing Putin's words. And Kisoudas, so the staffer, said the idea of a world of equal large areas is returning to Germany from Asia. So he's also echoing Schmidt's point. And while Poland is driving a wedge into the continent with its 3Cs initiative, Germany must build a bridge between West and East. And to this end, he's calling for a Central European initiative, a Mitteleuropa-Initiative that's separate from the EU and NATO. And these are some very dangerous ideas. They don't have any purchase at the moment in mainstream parties, fortunately, but it's very clear that there's something brewing on the very extreme fringes that one should definitely keep an eye on.
Fascinating. Thank you. Can we talk, Thomas, about a German political strategy in the long run, by which I mean quite often here in Britain, say, what is Britain's long-term goals for its military, or long-term goals regarding America or the Indo-Pacific or Europe? Is it helpful to talk about that in the German context? And with that in mind, there's been a lot of criticism, we were just referring to it, of Germany in America. Many people think Germany had this key role to play in the military sphere following its, of course, reunification and its vital role in the European economic space. Are there conversations about the implications of a Trump victory in 2024 for how Germany is perceived? Because that's very much an active conversation here, very much an active conversation in Ukraine and on this podcast. But is it in Germany?
Yes, it is, but I am a bit worried that it's basically not going far enough. So there was a recent interview, I think 1.5 weeks ago, in Die Zeit, one of Germany's major newspapers, and they asked Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, on precisely this question. And so the Zeit said, let's continue with something simple. What happens in terms of security policy if Donald Trump wins the election in the fall of 2024 and becomes US president again? And Pistorius gave a very striking and I would say quite worrisome answer. He said, well, thanks for the simple question. Where's the crystal ball you want me to look into? But seriously, we shouldn't panic now. When Giorgia Meloni became head of government in Italy, many predicted a setback for the whole of Europe. Domestically, you don't have to like everything Ms. Meloni does. But in terms of foreign policy, I don't have much to criticize. And I think first of all, Trump and Meloni are very different, also in terms of foreign policy, of course. And it's also striking to compare Trump re-election to an election in Italy, because, of course, the United States with their nuclear arsenal and etc., they play a much different role in terms of global security than Italy. And it's a very weird way of evading this question. And I do think there's some worry about a Trump victory, but not a strategy regarding what to do if this would happen. And I think this is very dangerous indeed. So there's another interesting podcast. And if your listeners understand German, I would recommend tuning in from time to time by Paul Ronsheimer, who is a journalist at the Bild. And he spoke to Lars Klingbeil, who is the head of Scholz's party, the Social Democrats. And in this podcast, Klingbeil wavered. He said, well, I spoke to a colleague in Lithuania. Is Putin going to go further? And Klingbeil says, well, I think I agree with my Lithuanian colleague that Putin might even target Lithuania. At the same time, he says, I don't think he actually is going to dare to attack the European Union. Then Klingbeil quite clearly said, well, Russia is a nuclear power. The entire society is now completely geared towards war. There's a huge worry that Trump might give up on Ukraine. There's a potential that there's a divide in the European Union that widens, and it's very important now to focus on the axis between Germany, France, and Poland. And I mean, this is all quite correct, but I'm missing a sense of urgency, because it's not unlikely that Trump might win. It's not unlikely that he might give up on Ukraine. And I think it would be good if Europe had a strategy. And starting with Germany, France, and Poland is probably a good idea. But I think it would be better to have such a strategy. And I don't think it's there at the moment.
I absolutely echo that. And I think that, unfortunately, we've been talking about it for some time on the podcast. Europe does not have a strategy. And the fear, of course, is that it's left it too late because of the amount of time required to build defensive capability. But just one last question from me, Thomas, before opening up the floor. We can't have you on without talking about something deeply historical. It's always one of the favourites for listeners. The last time you joined us, we talked about Putin's historical vision. Now, would you say we're also seeing a clash of different philosophies of history, different understandings about history at the moment? And if so, how would that view help us make sense of some of the current discussions, including perhaps the recent EU summit?
Yes, I think there are two bits that I would like to mention. So the one goes back to this concept of great regions, or however you want to call it. And that's basically, so what Carl Schmitt, this Nazi lawyer, did was he took the Monroe Doctrine, he took the concept of spheres of influence, and then basically fashioned it into sort of a new concept that was very useful for the Nazis before they invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. So the idea that you can divide up Central Europe, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, etc. And Schmitt was also famously unhappy with Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, because he said, well, this breaks this idea that you have great regions and great powers in those regions. And I would say that this idea of great regions and spheres of influence that can be where military action is justified, even if it goes against the sovereignty of a state, that this is still very much in the mind of, or very present in the mind of someone like Putin. And I would say that the West and also the European Union has a very different idea of sovereignty, because, I mean, some of your listeners might disagree, but I think in the context of geopolitics, the European Union and NATO is a great tool for preserving the sovereignty of the smaller states, particularly, for example, the Baltic states, etc., because it's very clear that without some sort of protection, a great power or great military power such as Russia would just overrun those countries. So there are two very different visions. The one is focused on great regions, and the other one is focused on sovereignty, even of very small states. And I think in some contexts, all of the European states are small unless they work together. The other sort of vision of history is, I think, that there's, and this is quite critical, is that there's a contrast between long-termism and short-termism. And about Putin, it's famously said that that in his room he pretended to talk to Ivan the Terrible or Stalin and whoever, and that he has a very longue durée view of history, which is, of course, entirely a construct. It's a fantasy of history, but still he thinks in decades and centuries and not in terms of a few years. And that's dangerous because it contrasts with, I think, a lot of the Western democratic politicians who mainly think in terms of maybe a year, maybe a budget year, maybe legislative period, so maybe a couple of years, but who don't think that at the moment we should be thinking in terms of a longue durée and our long-term vision. And going back to the first question, that's, I think, why the EU summit was quite significant, because precisely because the accession of Ukraine will take several years. I think Joe mentioned 2030. Because of that, it's good to have a long-term vision that goes beyond the immediacy of the current meetings or the current political debates.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Thomas Clausen, for joining us. That was really fascinating. I've just got one quick question as somebody who's not a massive German watcher. How secure is Olaf Schultzs at the moment? Are there any elections we should be aware of? And what's your sense of his political longevity at this moment in time?
I think it's probably all three coalition partners are quite keen on avoiding any elections at the moment, because in the polls, both the Liberals, so the party that I'm quite close to, the Greens and the SPD, they poll very badly. The AfD is doing quite well with over 20%, and no one wants elections at this point. And the fact that there is now this rugged compromise about the budget shows that they are still willing to get their act together. So I don't think there will be an election in Germany before 2025 when it's due. But also, I would say if there's an election, we would likely see either a coalition with the Conservatives and the SPD, or a Jamaica coalition that's the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the Greens. And I don't think that there would be a massive shift, or that would be a shock to Germany's policy towards Ukraine. So I do think that the main issue for Germany is the question of how Germany and the European Union deals with a Trump victory. And maybe the last thing I can quote, and that's another recommendation, there's Klaus Olshausen. He's a former NATO general. He works now for a think tank called the ISPSW, and they publish a few briefings every now and then. And he picked up a saying by the Dutch defense minister, Kaiser Ollongren. And she said, we have to move from how long it takes to whatever it takes for Ukraine to win this war. And I think in terms of strategic vision, this is very much what is needed. And we haven't seen enough of that. And that goes back to the discussion, of course, about Taurus.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Thomas Clausen, for your time and for coming on the podcast live. It's always appreciated. Let's move then to our final thoughts. Thomas, will give you a little bit of a break to catch your breath. So Francis or James, would you like to go first?
I'm happy to jump in first, David. Just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to all of those listeners who have sent their audio clips as requested on Friday. We were listening to a few of those this morning, and, well, it's wonderful, and obviously we'll have some montages going in future episodes of those. I think we've had several from Berlin, lots from America, I think one or two from Brazil, a couple from Australia, so just amazing. So thank you very much to all those who've done that, and to people who have shared on X or Twitter, whichever you use to refer it, photographs of you listening to the podcast with the hashtag Ukraine the latest. I haven't actually managed to look at today's. So I'm looking forward to doing that later on. So just a word about that to say thank you. And I said at the end of last week that we would share a list of charities that people may be interested to donate to, because it's probably the most requested question at this time of year. Now, as independent journalists, it's just important to say we can't really recommend particular charities for people to donate to. It's not our role. We've spoken to many charities this year, of course. Vans Without Borders will be familiar with many of you. GP Now, KHARPP or KHARPP, all brilliant charities that we've, of course, interviewed key components on. But what we're going to do, I think, is have a link to the Ukrainian Institute of London's list of charities and organisations they recommend. To stress, that's not only British charities, this is worldwide charities who are involved in supporting Ukraine, but they've compiled a very good list. So we will share that. It will be in the description for the episode and in the descriptions for the episode throughout the rest of the week.
Brilliant. Thank you, Francis. James Kilner in Riga.
Hi, David. So really we're now 3 months out from this Russian election. I think it's really worth for listeners keeping this in mind. Elections by their very nature are destabilising. Putin really did fire the starting gun on his campaign over the weekend. Like I said, on Saturday, he accepted the nomination officially as an independent candidate. And on Sunday, he used a United Russia conference to make a sort of what was a thinly disguised stump speech talking about the importance of sovereignty. He didn't reference Ukraine by name, but he talked about Russia not being one of those countries that could surrender its sovereignty to another country for a little piece of sausage. I mean, that was a clear reference to Ukraine, in his eyes, becoming a NATO US vassal state. So really, we're definitely election season in Russia. We've got 3 months until that's done, so keep an eye on that. With that in mind, and really importantly, we still haven't seen or heard anything of Alexei Navalny since December the 6th. He is, of course, the one of the main headline opposition figures in Russia. He's been in prison on extremism charges since 2021. He's down for 19 years. And the UN this morning has issued a statement saying they're very concerned about his welfare. Even though he is in prison, he is still influential. He can still agitate, and he has lots of supporters working on his behalf, mainly outside Russia, some inside Russia. But he is a huge figurehead for the opposition. So, and he's disappeared. There are rumours that he's been moved to a different prison, a higher security prison, etc., etc. But people are becoming very concerned about his safety. So, a very important story to watch out for.
Well, thank you very much, Francis and James Kilner, calling in from Riga. Thomas, just before we come to you, it's been a pleasure to spend so much time talking to you and hearing your thoughts on Germany. Of course, listeners, German listeners or otherwise, please do send in your questions as well, and we can certainly return to it in the future. But Thomas Clausen, would you like the very final words?
Well, thank you very much. So Francis just mentioned also Taurus, and maybe it's worth to focus on that question for tiny moment. Is it likely that Scholz is going to send Taurus? And here I would say only if the US follows up with more ATACMS. So I think the last time we saw them was in October, but I could be wrong. And I think he will only change his position if America moves forward first, as we have seen again and again with Scholz. But of course, it could also evolve depending on how the actual fighting on the front line goes. But I don't think that in terms of overall strategy, Germany is willing or able to take the lead. And I would say maybe that's also for the better. I think it makes sense for an overall strategy that's embedded in Western philosophies or Western approaches. And I don't think that Germany is prepared or equipped to move forward alone.
Thanks, Francis, James and Thomas. As listeners may remember, I spent some weeks in the summer accompanying British volunteers driving vehicles, aid and equipment out to the front lines in Ukraine. It's, therefore, a story close to my heart, so I wanted to understand more about the impact these vehicles can have, and the repercussions of the decision in London not to send cars to Ukraine that would be scrapped under London's new ULEZ zone. For listeners abroad, that's the ultra-low emission zone. So I spoke to Brooks Newmark, former Conservative MP and Minister for Civil Society, and founder of the charity Angels for Ukraine. Here's our conversation. Well, Brooks, thanks so much for your time. We've heard now for days the story that London Mayor Sadiq Khan has blocked a plan to send cars to Ukraine. Can you talk through your reaction to this? And it'd be good to hear maybe about the impact that these vehicles can have once they get in country.
Sure. So just to give a bit of background. So I've been out there for most of the war since the beginning, and mainly involved in logistics. So evacuating women and children from the front line. I evacuated over 35,000. And then sort of second part I've been doing is medical evacuations. So moving wounded soldiers and civilians from military hospitals to civilian hospitals. And then the third bit has been doing humanitarian aid drops. The reason why these vehicles are important is because there's a huge shortage of vehicles. It's a war. And, we've had to retrofit sort of white vans effectively into small ambulances and so on. The 4x4s, which I've been bringing over, which I know you've been involved in a little bit, are important because they're used for moving wounded people. They're used for moving ordnance, kit, anything that's really needed on the front line by soldiers. And interestingly enough, the average life of one of these vehicles is somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks, because you're sort of at the front line, which is why, I personally have never paid more than $3,500 for one of these, because the life cycle is the chances are they get hit by shrapnel or something, and they don't generally last a long time. So this begs the issue of the scrappage scheme. Now, Sadiq Khan, which I thought was had said to the Ukrainians that he was willing to let the Ukrainians have these vehicles for free, because otherwise he would have to pay for scrapping them and everything else. I was sort of surprised to read, I guess in the past week really, that he has now said that he won't, for some technical reason, which I don't understand, he won't allow people like my charity and other charities working in Ukraine to have these vehicles. He would prefer taxpayers in London to pay for the destruction of these vehicles with all the environmental impact as well as costs associated with that. And to me, that makes no sense. For us, it's important because we're trying to help Ukraine. This is a great way for Londoners to help Ukraine. And to say for some obscure technical reason, people like my charity can't have them to take over to Ukraine is almost Kafkaesque. And I don't understand it, because if it's a technical reason, then he can change the rules to get around that. To say, well, he said, and this is his solution, by the way, I've set up a website. So if people want to donate their cars, they can do that. That's nothing to do with the scrappage scheme. I can go, as I've been doing, going to friends of mine who've been donating 4x4s. That's not the issue. The issue is he is scrapping, I'm assuming, thousands and thousands of these vehicles that I believe could be used on the front line. Because at the end of the day, whether they're scrapped, blown up, or hit by shrapnel, at least they get a sort of a semi-second life by going out to somewhere like Ukraine. And by the way, what is important to know is that these vehicles, and we make sure, as do I think other charities, that they don't end up in the hands of civilians who then use them to drive around secondhand cars. And I think this has been an issue that I know some people have been concerned with. If it's a flashy new BMW, or secondhand BMW, I'm sure those do end up in civilian life. Most of these vehicles are pretty much on their last legs anyway. And what we try and do is get them, we have a mechanic who looks at them, make sure they're fit for purpose. They're then camouflaged. They're sort of generally painted green. And anything that needs to go in them to help the soldiers, we make sure is in the vehicles themselves. That's a bit of a long-winded answer to your question.
Reading our story that came out a few days ago, we've got this line. This is from Daniel Sheridan, defence editor. This week, Mr. Khan wrote to Mr. Klitschko, that's Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, to say he would not allow the proposal because it did not meet the, quote, legal threshold, end quote, that requires the ULEZ scrappage scheme to benefit Londoners from a, quote, economic, social and environmental perspective. So if that's the standard you have to get to sort of say yes to this, what's your response to that?
Yeah, my response is, okay, the economic is taxpayers have to pay for scrappage, right? So there is money that is being used to pay for the scrappage. This isn't done for free by somebody. So Sadiq Khan has to pay for that. That's the economic issue. The environmental issue is they're then scrapped, and the scrap is dealt with somewhere in the UK. So there's an environmental impact that's negative by actually going through the scrapping process, because 100% of these vehicles are not completely recycled. Number three, the social benefit clearly is we're doing something for a good charitable cause, which is obviously helping Ukraine. So for me, all three of those boxes are ticked. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what thresholds that they've created for those, but instinctively, I feel all three of those hurdles that he or his lawyers have set are met. And if he really wants this to happen, that's the point of being mayor. He can make this happen. If he doesn't want to make it happen, he won't make it happen.
The end of our story says a City Hall spokesman said that altering the ULEZ scheme for the purposes of exporting vehicles to Ukraine is not possible within the current limits of the GLA Act, and the spokesman insisted the authorities stood in solidarity with Ukraine. Is this not something in that case that the Conservative government can get involved in, if it's something that's beyond the purview of the London authorities?
I mean, I'm hoping so. I mean, I've written to my local MP, which is Priti Patel. I've contacted the ex-Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. I know Bob Seeley, I think the MP, is involved in this. And I'm assuming other people have been contacting their MPs on this issue, because it's ridiculous, I find.
To sum up your argument then, what would you say to Sadiq Khan if you had the opportunity?
I think, look, Sadiq, you have an opportunity here to show a bit of leadership here. And my view is you need to deal with your in-house counsel, in-house lawyers, to actually make the argument that this does meet all three thresholds. Lawyers are there not to always say no. Lawyers should be there to also find solutions to problems. And it seems to me that people who Sadiq Khan surrounds himself with in London are a bunch of people who all they can do is say no rather than figure out a solution. I'm asking him as Mayor of London to find a solution.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.